in an address that risks heightening transatlantic tensions after he said on a trip to Beijing last week that Europe shouldn't be pulled into tensions between Washington and Beijing over Taiwan. Mr. Macron delivered the address in The Hague on Tuesday, April 11, 2023, as he began a two-day state visit to the Netherlands, the first state visit to the country by a French president in 23 years. Macron claimed that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic had highlighted Europe's dependency on foreign providers of commodities such as medicine and energy. Welcome. This is Rain Smith, and you're watching the New Africa Channel.
Those who decided to cooperate, to make trade with neighbors, even if they were not allies, Russia, for energy. Because we decided, de facto, that trade could be the best way to cooperate, could create irreversible links and precisely avoid the others to be aggressive. They decided to weaponize the energy, putting us in a completely crazy and unbelievable situation. Pandemic and war just pushed us in a situation to discover that we have to reduce our dependencies if you want to preserve the European identity. Otherwise, we will progressively be dependent on everything.
European sovereignty may have seemed like a French idea, Macron said, or even wishful thinking. But he warned of the dangers of a Europe that is overly reliant on other world powers, saying it places Europe in a situation where it cannot decide for itself. European sovereignty should mean that the continent can choose our partners and shape our own destiny, he said. This means that we must strive to be rule makers rather than rule takers. But Macron also said Europe would maintain great relationships with its allies. Defending sovereignty doesn't mean to shy away from allies, he said. It means we must be able to choose our partners and shape our own destiny, rather than being, I would say, a mere witness of the dramatic evolution of this world. This we can do in a cooperative manner, in keeping with our spirit of openness and partnership, he added. Macron's speech in The Hague was preceded by controversy over the French president's remarks on Europe and China over the weekend. He stated in an interview with Politico and Les Echos last Sunday that the European Union should lessen its reliance on the U.S. and avoid being drawn into a conflict between China and the U.S. over Taiwan, emphasizing the need for the European Union's strategic autonomy. He said, "The question Europeans need to answer: is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? The worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the U.S. agenda and a Chinese overreaction." With these ideas, Macron effectively submits to China and Russia's post-Cold War joint proclamation on the multipolar world and the establishment of a new international order. The Cold War and a bipolar system were deemed obsolete in the document. That text advocates dialogue and cooperation rather than hegemony and power politics. Macron wants Europe to become a third pole, competing with the United States and the Russia-China alliance. However, Macron's European dream, as well as his stance on the Taiwan impasse between Beijing and Washington, have already drawn harsh criticism. The influential Wall Street Journal writes that Macron has blundered and is undermining U.S.-led deterrence against China. Emmanuel Macron fancies himself a Charles de Gaulle for the 21st century, which includes distancing Europe from the U.S., began a scorching Sunday editorial in the Wall Street Journal. No one wants a crisis over Taiwan, much less to accelerate one, but preventing one requires a credible deterrent, the editorial continued. Emmanuel Macron has completely misunderstood the situation, says political analyst Antoine Bondes. Macron puts all the blame for the tension on the United States, according to Bondes, forgetting that China's ambition is to take control of Taiwan to stabilize the global order. Also, U.S. Senator Marco Rubio said on Twitter that we need to find out if Emmanuel Macron speaks for Europe. Meanwhile, Marc Julien, the lead China analyst at the French Institute of International Relations, said the bigger problem wasn't what Mr. Macron said, but what he didn't say during the China visit. Mr. Macron didn't publicly reiterate that France supported Taiwan's status quo and that any attempt to change it by the use of force would be unacceptable. Mr. Julien said,
I need to ask Europe, does he speak for them? Because we're pretty heavily involved in Ukraine right now. We're spending a lot of our taxpayer money on a European war.
Experts on both sides of the Atlantic have long recognized strategic autonomy as France's primary foreign policy principle. They are outraged, however, by the timing of Macron's latest remarks, which come at a time when Washington is spending billions in European security through its assistance for Ukraine, and when Western unity is most crucial. Macron doesn't want Europe to get caught up in crises that are not ours, like Taiwan, said Ivo Daalder, head of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and former advisor to former U.S. President Barack Obama. But he is perfectly fine with relying on U.S. security commitments to address crises like Ukraine and Europe. That's not strategic autonomy. That's strategic nonsense, said Daalder in a Twitter post. Nevertheless, French officials said Mr. Macron's comments were being overinterpreted and his position on Taiwan hadn't changed. France is a U.S. ally with whom Paris shares common values, and China is a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, the official said. So what do you think of today's video? Do you think Macron is right to encourage Europe to reduce its reliance on foreign powers and avoid getting dragged into a confrontation between China and the U.S. over Taiwan? Or do you think in trying to save France, Macron is actively dividing Europe? Let us know what you think in the comments below.